and the return of the hostages. And we're going to continue with the, hold on one second, the source we had started with last week, which is Dosa ben Hyrcanus. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of the story and just give a few minutes, in case you weren't here last week, a little bit of a backdrop. This story appears, hold on one second, in Yevamot 16a. It is a story that is less known than the normal Yavne cycle of stories. Normally what we know when we think of Yavne, first of all, we know Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked Vespasian for Yavne as a place of restoring and rebuilding and reviving the Jewish people and Torah, the Torah of the Jewish people. And then we know the stories that come out of Yavne, some of the tension in Yavne around leadership, around decision making. And I mentioned two of the stories last week, the famous stories with Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua that lead to the brief overturning of Rabban Gamliel and the sharing of the leadership position with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the famous story of the Avin of Achnai, where Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is essentially excommunicated from the Beit Midrash. We did look at those stories last week. I think all of us have seen those stories before, so I'm not going to go back. But what ends up emerging from the cycle of Yavne stories is this sense of complicated leadership and decision making, and yet nonetheless, there's no real choice, meaning when Rabbi Yehoshua stands up and says, Lo b'shamayim hi, right? It is not in heaven. We all cheer because we have been formed and we have been shaped by that narrative as the courage, as the innovation, as the inspiration of how Rabbinic Judaism led us forward. And what I'm bringing now is a story, as I said, a less well-known story. It's a story that Moshe Simon Shoshan, who is a friend of mine, wrote an article about and mentioned several times. He just wrote it last year in 2022. He mentioned last year that that no one had really written about this story, and that he felt it added a darker perspective of what's going on in Yavne. That I think we've all teased out. Many teachers have talked about the complexity of excommunicating Rabbi Eliezer. So we no longer look at that as a clear story of good and less good, and they had a like. It's a difficult story. There's a sense of mourning in the story. Rabbi Gamliel dies at the end of the story. So I don't think we think of it as a story with a happy ending, but we tend to champion the sages nonetheless. And this story is going to be critical of the sages, and that's what makes it an interesting story. And we're going to see where the Bavli ends the story, and so on. Okay, Tajma. So I just want to review what the argument is before we get into the story. Again, just as a moment or two of review, we have a question about the tzarat habat, the idea of the rival wife of a daughter. Now, there's an argument. What happens if, we'll just use the example here, your daughter married her uncle? In other words, I'm Avraham, I have a brother Yitzchak, and my daughter Sarah married my brother, which is totally legitimate and would have been actually a very protective marriage. A very protected relationship, with the understanding that an uncle would care well for his niece. And Yitzchak actually has two wives, Sarah and Yocheved, no relationship to one another. And lo aleinu, Yitzchak dies without children. And Avram now has to consider doing yibum with one of the wives, and of course he cannot do it with his daughter. So Hillel's position is, if one of the wives is prohibited from a brother because of incest, then the other wife goes free without yibum and chalitza. And again, I think this is familiar to most of us. The idea that if one of the wives is a direct relation to the brother, one of the remaining brothers, then the other wife goes free and she can marry whoever she wants. Beit Shammai's position is the rival wife must be taken in yibum or chalitza. Now, this is an enormous argument. I don't want to soften it. It's a really big argument because according to Beit Hillel, Yocheved prances off and can marry a Kohen. She's a widow. She can marry whoever she wants. Her future children will not be mamzerim. And Shammai says if Yocheved doesn't do yibum or chalitza with one of the remaining brothers, her children are potentially mamzerim, depending on which position you follow, right? So it's a really big machloket, okay? And it continues on after Hillel and Shammai are no longer with us. And notice that the rabbis in this story are the same rabbis that appear in the Avin of Achnai story, in the Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua story. In other words, we're talking about the same constellation of rabbis living really in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, so 70 CE onward, and this argument is still going on. So they asked Rabbi Yoshua, what is the halacha with regard to the rival wife of a daughter? He said to them, it is a matter of dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And accordance with whose statement is the halacha, he said to them, why are you inserting my head between two great mountains? I fear lest these two mountains break my skull. In other words, I don't want to get involved in this machloket. Obviously, a decision has to be made. And I'll testify that there were two great families, and they ruled like Beit Hillel, and it was okay. One of them came from a high priest. In other words, I'm not going to side between Shammai and Hillel, but I can just tell you that I know children who descended from the rival wife, known as Yocheved in our story, without Yibum and Chalitza, there was no stigma or blemish to their children, and a high priest even came out of one of those families. Okay. Come in here. Now we're ready for the story that we're up to. Come in here, another source. In the time of Dosa ben Harkenes, Hiltru Tzarat Habat La'achim, the rival wife of a daughter was permitted to the brothers, was permitted to do yibum with the brothers. Shmamina asu shmamina. That suggests they ruled like Beit Shammai, and they acted in accordance to Beit Shammai. And I mean, this is really difficult because we had Rabbi Yoshua not really wanting to decide, but suggesting that that it was from Beit Hillel. And now we have a story that in the time of Dosa ben Harkenes, which again is largely end of Second Temple, beginning right after the destruction, they ruled like Beit Shammai. And now the rabbis are going to go and wage a holy war because we know from all the learning we did last year, the halakha is like Beit Hillel. So who do you think you are ruling like Beit Shammai? I'll just point out one more thing. It doesn't say that Rabbi Dosa himself permitted the rival wife to marry the brother. It just says in his time. That's an important detail to pay attention to. Okay, Act 1. Bimei Dosa ben Harkenes, hitiru tzarat habat la'achim. In the time of Dosa ben Harkenes, we're going back to that statement, they permitted the rival wife, Yocheved, to marry the brother of the dead man, right? Even though his daughter Sarah was also married to the dead man. In other words, there's an incestuous relationship between one of the wives and the brother. But we say, okay, but the other wife isn't incestuous. Yocheved is permitted. And Beit Shammai allowed Yibum or Chalitza to take, not just allowed, he forced, meaning there's no choice. That is what has to be done. Okay. The matter was difficult in the eyes of the rabbis because Dosa ben Harkenes was a great sage, and yet, and this is a very important point, Chacham Gadol Haya, Ve'enav kamu milavo leveit hamidrash. And his eyes were fixed, which we're going to understand means blindness, and prevented him from coming to the house of study. So we have a great sage who does not come to the house of study. And so they're kind of tearing out their hair in, well, what do we do with this? Oh, I guess we're going to have to go to him because he's not here in the house of study, which already one could ask a question. Why is he not in the house of study? I understand he's blind. Rav Sheshet was blind. Rav Yosef was blind. We've had blind men in the house of study. Why is he not in the house of study if he's such a great man? Amru, umi yelech biyodio. Now, again, I pointed out the parallel to the Tanur of Achnai story. Who's going to go inform him that we are protesting what we think is his decision in this matter in following Shammai? Who's going to go tell him? Now, if you remember in the Achnai story, they say, who's going to go tell Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus he's been excommunicated? Rabbi Akiva raises his hand, okay? So this already has certain shadows or echoes of an earlier story that we have to go tell him. Well, what are we telling him? Are we telling him he's wrong? Are we excommunicating him? He's already not in the Beit Midrash, so we have to go to him. Okay. Amar lahem Rabbi Yoshua ani elech. So Rabbi Yoshua said, you know what, I'll go. Va'acharav, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Va'acharav mi, Rabbi Akiva. Here's my constellation of 3 Yavna sages, the big ones. Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who ended up replacing Rabban Gamliel briefly, but then partnered with him in running the academy in Yavne. And of course, always Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is always going to be in these stories. Okay. Halchu v'amdu al petach beito. I said this is really a very powerful description, crossing the threshold. Nichnesa shivchato amralo Rebbe Chachmei Yisrael ba'in etzlecha. Amarla yikansu v'nichnesu. So we have what I call, or what Moshe Shoshan called, the crossing of the threshold. The maidservant who has to announce them, that appears also in other stories. They're standing at the entrance to the door. They have to wait to be invited in. And the Rebbe says, and the maidservant says, Rebbe, the masters have come to see you. And what does he say immediately? Yikansu, let them in. V'nichnesu. He has no idea why they are coming. He invites them in. We, the reader, know they are coming to inform him that he is in the wrong. Tfaso the Rabbi Yoshua, he grabs a hold of Rabbi Yoshua. V'hoshivahu al mitah shel zahav. He placed him on a couch of gold. At this point in the story, what a beautiful hachnasat orchim. He brings him in. He puts him on this ornate couch. He welcomes him. Amarlo. And more l'talmidcha acher v'yeshev. And Rabbi Yoshua says, look, there's another student, right? At this point, addressing him as Rebbe, and we're your talmidim. We've come to visit with you. Amar lo mihu, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Amar v'yesh lo ben la'Azariah chaverenu. Now, this line tells me how long he has not been in the academy. He says, did our friend Azariah have a son? Wow, I didn't even know, right? Even if we go with the story that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is 17 or 18 when he's appointed, it still suggests it's been many years since Dosa, the Chacham Gadol, has been in the Beit Midrash. Or maybe he's never been invited into the Beit Midrash in Yavne. And so he is so excited about this. Kara alav hamikra, nar hayiti v'gam zakanti v'lo ra'iti tzadik ne'azav v'zaro mavakesh lachem. Wow. I have been young, now I'm old. I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. Wow, like his seed is still learning Torah, right? Bread and Torah are parallel, right? He has a son who learns Torah. He's excited about this. He grabs him and seats him upon a golden couch. Amarlo, Rebbe, emor l'talmidcha acher v'yeshev. He said to him, wait, Rebbe, Rabbi Yoshua said, well, there's another one. Will you address your other disciple? Amarlo mihu. Who's the third? Remember, he's blind. He doesn't see. Akiva ben Yosef. Amarlo, atahu Akiva ben Yosef sheshimcha holech misov ha'alom v'ad sofo. Shvi b'ni, shev b'ni, shev, komodcha yirbu b'Yisrael. Again, what a beautiful invitation in seating them on the golden couches, showing enthusiasm for each of them, saying a personal word to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and to Akiva ben Yosef. But for us, two things emerge. First of all, we get a sense maybe a little bit of a doddering, blind old man, right? Wow, he's so excited they're visitors. He's been out of the academy, out of it for so long. And right, he's just so excited to have them come, and he sits them down and he praises them. And again, we know as readers, this is not a cordial visit. They're about to really attack him. And we're just watching this unfold. Act 2, Scene 3. I pointed out last week, a different word is used, but the word is Hekifu chaverim ka'achnai zo. In the Achnai story, they encircle him, using it, right? They surround him. Here we also have, they encircle him with legal arguments. They begin ki'ilu talking Torah and bringing one argument after another. Ad she'igiu l'tzarat habat. And very intentionally, they're leading up to the question of the rival wife, right? But even that language of encircling, right? Trapping one's prey. He's going to be tightly encircled. He's not going to be able to get away. We're going to gradually unfold this, and eventually we're going to get to what we want to get to, which is the tzarat habat. Amarulo. Tzarat habat mahu, as if innocently. What do you think about the rival wife story? The rival wife of the daughter. Amar lahem machloket Beit Shammai o Beit Hillel. It's a known machloket, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. Halacha k'divrei mi. Who's the halacha like? And we're all ready, right? We're ready for him to say Beit Shammai, and we're poised to pounce on him. Amar lahem halacha k'Beit Hillel. Halacha is like Beit Hillel. Everyone knows that. And now there's almost like a shocked silence. Amru lo, v'halo mishimcha amru halacha k'Beit Shammai. Wait a minute. They're like shocked. Did they quote you as saying the halacha is like Beit Shammai? Amar lahem, dosa shamatem. Did you hear my name quoted? Oh, ben Hyrcanus shamatem. Maybe you heard the name of Hyrcanus, the son of Hyrcanus. Amar lo, chaye Rebbe. Stam shamanu. Actually, we heard it anonymously. We just assumed it was you, right? So this is a really intense critique. This is a really intense critique of how the rabbinic establishment is functioning, right? This idea, we're going out to wage our holy war against any Shammai is left. And we know Dosa ben Hyrcanus was a student of Shammai. So we're going to go shut him down, even though he's not in Yavne, right? And they're all prepared for this. And they're totally, totally mistaken. Because even a Shammaiist knows the halacha follows Beit Hillel. Now, furthermore, he says, there's another Ben Hyrcanus. Maybe you mistook me. And they in almost ashamed, right? In a shamed manner, they say, it's Ben Hyrcanus. But sorry, we didn't hear it in anyone's name. We just assumed, right? This assumption of who's saying what. And I will say, I can take that we tend to, I will admit of myself that at times I have jumped to conclusions when I've heard something hearsay about, oh yeah, he must have said that, or she must have said that. I know that, right? That's totally their position. And the warning here, we have to be so careful in quoting someone or mistaking someone's quote just because we assume there's something, right? Like the rabbis fall into this, and this plot, the entire plot is driven by a misunderstanding. They have failed to genuinely seek out and give respect to someone from the previous generation, right? They've alienated him. Like, you're old, you're not really with us anymore. Like, we've moved on, we're in Yavne. But they didn't take the time, and that's where the story is basically going to be going, to seek out someone from the previous generation And they certainly should have clarified before going to rebuke him. Okay, so this is, I would say, the low point of the story in showing, I would say, a degree of irresponsibility. Now, it's very easy to think about failed, right? Like, this is so familiar, right? This is something that was written 2,000 years ago, and yet it could be written today, right? The failure of the establishment, right? When you become an establishment, what is your responsibility to what came before? How can we learn from what came before, right? So we're gonna go even deeper into that. Amar Lahem. So Dosa, to his credit, seems to be okay. And he says, Ach katan yeshli. And he says, I have a little brother, Bechor Satanhu. He's the firstborn of Satan. We actually don't see that language used anywhere else. It's used actually in the New Testament. Okay, I looked up one or two references to the son of the devil, or my father of the devil or something. But I don't have, and Moshe also couldn't explain exactly where that phrase comes from. But he certainly is being dismissive of his brother, but not really. He's basically going to say he's really, really smart. When he says firstborn of Satan, it's not like he's evil and wicked and like you can just ignore him. He's going to say this guy is sharp. Yonatan Shmo, Talmidei Shammai. He happens to be among the disciples of Shammai. V'hizaru shelo yipakech etchem b'halachot. And now this becomes a very important part of the story. He basically says, be careful, because he is really good at deductive reasoning and interpretation based on deductive reasoning. He can throw at you 300 proofs, logical proofs, that the rival wife of the daughter is permitted. If you want, and this is a dig, because especially Rabbi Akiva is built on deductive reasoning, on logical proofs, on using the text and showing how the vav and the little crown and so on can be built into all sorts of interpretive frameworks. And he basically says, oh yeah, my brother's really good at that. He's a disciple of Shammai. Aval me'id ana ani alai shamayim va'aretz. He basically says he now invokes shamayim va'aretz, which really brings us back to Breshit and to the end of Dvarim of Moshe. Ha'azinu ata shamayim va'adabera va'aretz imrei fi. Right? He invokes shamayim va'aretz, which is what Moshe invoked. Sha'al meducha zo yashav Chagai Navi. I want to tell you that the mortar I'm sitting on, this kind of rough stool I'm sitting on, Chagai the Navi sat. Now, the Goanim are going to try to say, wait, has he been alive for hundreds of years? Chagai lived several hundred years ago. But he's going to say, Chagai Navi, the beginning of Bayit Sheni, sat there and said, Amar Shlosha Dvarim, Sarat Habat Asura, Amon U'Moav Ma'asrei Ma'aser Ani B'Shvi'it, U'Mekablim Gerin Min HaKardoyin U'Min HaTarmudim. He says, yeah, I mean, by the way, he doesn't say he heard it from Chagai. He says he knows that Chagai sat on this stool, and the stool has been passed down with Chagai's teaching. And he says, don't you guys know the transmission from Chagai? You're so busy with your deductive reasonings, with your intellectual prowess, with your academy, but I'm going to testify with Shamayim Va'aretz that this simple stool, Chagai sat here and he taught about the rival wife and two other things, which I'm not going to, that in Ammon and Moab, even land that was conquered, you still take Maser Ani, even during Shemitah. And we actually learned a little bit about that last year. And you take converts from these two towns, okay, Karduyin and Tarmudim. But wow, like the story really could end right here. And Moshe Shoshan suggests the original story might have ended right here. He's blown the sages out of the water. He's basically said, your fancy footwork in the academy, which I wasn't invited. He doesn't even say it, I would say, in an obnoxious way. He says it like in a very authentic way. He's basically saying, I'm part of that train of transmission, meaning like I pass on the tradition to people who come and seek it out. He's very humble. He doesn't take credit for it. He says, look, this little stool that you are on the gold couches. I'm sitting on a simple stool, but it's the stool of transmission, right? Like, Me'id alai shamayim va'aretz. He basically just tells it as it is. And he goes from being kind of the blind Eli at the end of his life, who can't see, who doesn't know what's happening with the Aron, to really someone more like Achia HaShiloni, who sees the future, who's a seer, right? He suddenly, we see that he is extremely wise, humble and extremely wise, that he's sitting in the true seat of the prophets, that he's not a doddering old man at all, that his blindness doesn't incapacitate him in any way, because he has the vision of transmission, right? So it's really, really very powerful and very beautiful. And I think ending here would have been a great story. There are reasons where, again, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of how an academic scholar like Moshe Shoshan proves that some of this story is probably brought from the Yerushalmi and so on. We're going to keep reading it because it is in the Bavli, but I really just want to let what I would say the first ending of the story kind of sit. And it really is an enormous critique of Yavne. Like, you're getting sucked into the world of didactic reasoning, of intellectual prowess, of interpretation. Don't forget the transmission. Don't forget the Misora. We need both. I want to say it's very clear. It's very clear to everyone reading the story, everyone writing the story. We need both. But if it gets in the way of transmissions of this nature from Haggai down to Dosa, then something's wrong. If you're not seeking out the earlier generation to tap into the earlier traditions and transmissions, then there's a major flaw, and you're going to make these mistakes. And he even warns them, and we're going to see the brother Yonatan is going to show up. That's what makes the last part of the story interesting. Yonatan's going to show up. And Yonatan is the master of deductive reasoning, and by the way, he's a Shamayist. Tana, nichnasu b'petach achad, yatsu b'shlosha ptachim. So what we have here is they go in together, right? In one entrance, but it's a very powerful image that they end up leaving through 3 doors. I just want to quote a pasuk from Devarim, which might be what the author is borrowing from. Give me one moment, please. I should have had it next to me. It's Devarim, it's the Tochacha, Devarim, hold on a second, 28-25. I'm just going to pull it up. I thought I had written it into the source sheet, but I didn't. Hashem will put you to rout before your enemies. You shall march out against them by a single road, but flee from them by many roads. So I do think it's hard to ignore that image that they came united for battle, but then they're completely like vanquished. They're scattered through 3 doors. Pagab over Rabbi Akiva. Now this is where Yonatan shows up. Again, very interesting. Akshile ba'okma. So he asked him a question. Rabbi Akiva asked Yonatan a question, and Rabbi Akiva can't answer it. Marlo, Atahu Akiva sheshimcha holech misof ha'olam va'ad sofo. What, you're the big Rabbi Akiva? And I remember Dosa said, "You're the great Rabbi Akiva. I've heard of you." Yonatan's like, "Wait, is this a joke? You're that Akiva?" He completely disgraces him. He says, "You're lucky you still have achieved the level of cattle herders." Now, by the way, we're going to see what Rabbi Akiva says. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva va'afilu l'ro'etzo. No, not even that of shepherds. Now, of course, we know, and we're going to segue in a few weeks into Rabbi Akiva's beginning as a shepherd. The end of the story has power for a few reasons. First of all, I do like it that we meet Yonatan and that his brother is correct. Yonatan is the master of exposition. Yonatan is the master of like didactic reasoning, logical reasoning, twisting arguments, and he beats Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is supposed to be our hero. He's supposed to be our strongest representative of the future of rabbinic Judaism. And here comes this student of Shammai who like puts him in his back pocket and embarrasses him. And to Rabbi Akiva's credit, and this is why the story is going to continue ultimately with Akiva. Akiva says, "You're right." Like, he humbles himself. He says, "Afilu the ro'etzon, I'm even lower than a cattle herder. I'm only a mere shepherd." right? And that's where the story ends in the Bavli, with the great Akiva being humbled, but Akiva accepts the humbling, right? And that's why we can go back to Yavne, because ultimately with humility, we can leave this story and re-enter Yavne, having learned a lot about not jumping to conclusions, right? Not just assuming because we've heard a teaching, it's associated with the greatest sage of that generation. We really should check our facts. Having learned that there is value, not just value, there is richness in the earlier generation. And maybe instead of having them outside of the Beit Midrash, we should invite them in, right? They should be part and parcel of how we learn and how we teach. And we shouldn't create a binary of transmission versus didactic reasoning. And finally, humility, right? Like the humility piece is so enormous here. And that Rabbi Akiva ends the story with utmost humility, not beaten, not defeated, not like, right? But recognizing, wow, I have work to do. I'm going to top your insult. Like I'm going to even of myself say I'm only a shepherd, right? Like I'm going back to my beginning and I'm going to start again. And so I think that's very powerful. I will just show you before I stop sharing and take any comments or questions. The Yerushalmi actually has them all going in before Yonatan. And this is where Moshe Shoshan, Simon Shoshan will suggest the Bavli reworked this into something that we just saw, just Akiva, just Yonatan, and so on. I actually like the Bavli's ending, but the Yerushalmi has them all going in, and Yonatan sits before them. He doesn't get up, right? He doesn't welcome them. They go in, and Yonatan sat before them. He explained to them, but they did not understand. He explained to them, but they did not understand. They began to doze because they don't understand. Imagine sitting in a class, a long lecture where the teacher is droning on and on about particle physics, and you have no idea what's going on. And as much as you try, because you took AP physics, you are not following this. So you begin to fall asleep, like you can't understand it. He said to them, "Why are you dozing?" He began to throw clumps of earth at them. Some say they entered by one door and left by three. So in some ways, by the way, this fits better of, like they can't get away fast enough. Like, just get us out of here. He's made us feel so small and so stupid. So I think in some ways that scene works better than them running away from Dosa, because I don't see anything in the Dosa ben Hyrcanus dialogue that vanquished them. Like, he doesn't vanquish them. He doesn't send them out utterly humiliated. And so, when we talk about how stories borrow from each other, I think that there is something to, how the Bavli takes pieces from other places and turns it into a story. But I, it's really an interesting contrast to the Tanur of Achnai, because Rabbi Eliezer really is an anti-hero, and he refuses to budge. And I admire Dosa. I think he is a hero. I think he doesn't show anger at the sages. He doesn't show resentment at the sages. He has humility, and yet he shares with them, right? He basically very, I don't know if the word is gently, but very gradually and very, with a lot of integrity and authenticity, really reveals to them the error of their ways in the way that, right, an older person might do with a younger person. And they get it. They understand that they have, they have made major errors here in how they have been running the establishment. And by ending with Rabbi Akiva saying, back to being a shepherd, I really do think what I'm taking from there is Rabbi Akiva says, I have to go back and rethink everything, right? I have to go back to my beginning and start from there. So, and this is Rabbi Akiva in his heyday, right? He's already known from one end of the world to the other for his greatness. And yet, he's humbled. Okay, anyone have a comment or a question before we move on to a new topic that we're going to be starting? Happy to let people unmute and ask, sign, or comment something you want to share from this story.
I have a question. This is Helen.
Hi, Helen.
I came in late, so I don't know who this Yonatan is, or Jonathan.
Yes. He's the brother of Dosa ben Hyrcanus. Dosa ben Hyrcanus called him brother of Satan, right? Gives him this like insanely intense epithet. And he says, my brother is brilliant and he's going to argue you under the table. Don't even bother. He has 300 answers to why the rival wife of his daughter is permitted. If you go that route, you're going to lose. I'm just letting you know. Like, he is really, like, hats off to him. Like, I can't come close. So he's Dosa's brother. He's Dosa's brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And he is a Shammaiist through and through. And the reason Dosa is softer is because Dosa believes in the transmission. He may have been a student of Shammai. He knows the halachas like Hillel. We saw that also with another disciple of Shammai, whose name is escaping me, who ends up at a seminal moment bringing the halacha of Hillel. It had to do with the Korban Pesach, something to do with the Korban on the Temple Mount. And we see there too a disciple of Shammai who is able to recognize the need for the teaching of Hillel. And obviously those are our heroes because they recognize the need to synergize, to synthesize. Anyone else?
Sorry, is Dosa connected to Eliezer Hyrcanus?
No, yeah, good question. No, they're not related. And in English, it's interesting. The academics are very careful to spell Hyrcanus, H-A-R-K, and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is spelled H-Y-R-K. So it's spelled differently, very deliberately, and it could be. I think there's a vav or there's an extra letter in how Eliezer spells his name. It just shows the impact of the Greeks, right? That they have these Greek last names, that their father's names were Hyrcanus, but I don't think it says more than that. Hyrcanus and Hyrcanus, right? Those are Greek names, but it just shows the influence of the Greeks on life at that time, the end of Bayit Sheni.
Thank you. So I have a question. Hi,
Yes,
first of all, thank you. I thank you, and I didn't think what you said at the beginning was inappropriate at all. I appreciate it. Thank you. My question is, so what I'd like to know is how can I'd like to find out some sort of reading, like where I have which Rebbeim or which period of time and what their little bit of who they were and what their philosophies were. Like that's what I'm learning from you in this year. But is there any way I could get sort of an overview of this so I could actually see it for myself?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm happy to drop. It's a really, I think, a really good article and a really clear article, Moshe Shoshan's article, which I think, well, it's an academic Talmud article, but I have to say it was a really pleasant one to read. I actually need to write him and say, wow, some of them are so dense and obtuse, and like I get bored in the middle. I found this really fascinating. I would say the end got a little obtuse, but the analysis was excellent and will give you, I think, insight. I can drop it into the chat or have Matan send it. Maybe it's better if Matan sends the link.
Yeah, if you get it in the chat, I don't know how to.
It was very easy to find,
you.
and I appreciated that JQR made it available.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing I would say is, part of what we've been doing last year and this year is really getting to know the sages through looking at their teachings. And I think Benny Lau, Rav Lau's book, The Sages, that's what he's doing. And I think he does a really good job. I tend to flesh it out a little more. I choose different sources than he's taught. I sometimes go look up other information from other scholars, but I think he gives a very good baseline about any of the individual scholars we're bringing. So I think that is also an important resource. And I'll just say one more thing. If you don't want to read through, because his chapters are a little dense, Schottenstein has put out an introductory volume to their Talmud with short biographies of each of the Tannaitic and Amoraitic sages. I was actually just in Pomerantz, just an anecdote. I walked in and the Pomerantz sons seemed to have been called up for reserve duty. So they had two lovely people working there who had no idea where anything was in the store. And if you've been to Pomerantz, that's already a challenge because it's a store.
Wait, so this is,
but nothing
this
makes
is by
so much of it doesn't make sense. So there was
what's the name of the book by
who
Schottenstein?
was looking for the Schottenstein. He was looking like, where do I find biographies of the sages? I do Daf Yomi. I'm like, okay. So I found it high up on a shelf, right? I managed to get it for him. But it was a lovely moment. And then someone else is like, can you find me a book about Mashiach? Which I did, right? Like someone's like, do you work here? I'm just helping out. So it just was an anecdote.
What is the name of the book you told me that I should look at from Schottenstein?
it's Schottenstein's, I think it's called Introduction to the Talmud or Introduction to Talmudic Personalities. I think if you even put in Schottenstein Talmud Introduction volume, you'll find it. I can send that also, just the link to
Okay,
that.
thanks.
They
That would be
sell it
perfect.
at
Thank you.
Pomerantz. I'm sure Chavruta sells it, like any of the bookstores will
Okay.
sell it. And it really is an excellent resource for
Okay.
short, like a short biographical overview when they lived.
That's what I need. That's what I need. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's what he needed also. He's like, yeah, I have the sages, but it takes too long to get the information. He just wanted like a
Yes.
paragraph. Okay, good. I'm glad I'm
Okay,
able to give you
thanks.
some resources, and I'll send out an email then to this class, to whoever's here, just with that information, so people don't have to get,
Perfect.
how do I spell that? Okay, I'll help you out. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at next is something I taught many, many years ago at Pardes, which is the period of early Christianity, Jesus in the Talmud, some of the stories of hereticism, what we'll call the minim, and why it posed such a challenge to the sages. So that's really, it's the next chapter in Rav Lau's book. I know some of you like to know what the chapters are. It's chapter 13, the struggle against the heretics. I'm going to bring much more material than is in that book because I taught the class, sorry, like 15 years ago, but I remember it well. And so right now I do not yet have a source sheet. I'm borrowing from Sfaria largely, and I think the link went out in the email today. I will put together my own source sheet probably by next week. So right now I'm just going to share my screen with the sources so we can get started. I was, as you all understand, this week has been crazy for everyone, and prepping for class has been one of the bigger challenges. But I'm going to now share my screen, and we're going to look at what I think is a really interesting source on their concerns. Okay. This also, by the way, we are you know what, I'm going to actually do something else, and I'm stopping to share. I just want to give you a historical timeline, especially because Audrey really just asked for it. So let me just share my screen. Hold on a second, I apologize. There's a really great source. Where is it? Oh, why is Facebook there? I don't know. One more minute. Okay, now I'm ready. Here it is. Okay, I just want to do the timeline that we're going to be looking at because we're going to be looking at early Christianity. And I just want to say, Jesus is a fascinating figure. He really did not set out to start a religion. I think we all know that, right? It's his students who turned Jesus and Christianity into what it became. So let's take a look. The life of Jesus, 4 BCE till around 33 CE, right? He doesn't live that long. 34 CE to 62 CE, the life of Paul. 70, of course, is the destruction of the temple. 70 to 100 are the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. Now, that's a really important period for us because largely 70 to 100 is when we're dealing, right? That's the period we're in with the Tanaim and Yavne and the period that we're in with Yoshua and Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva's a little later, more like 120, but we're very much in the very early years. Jesus is dead. He's been dead for quite a long time, but his students have begun circulating his writings in his name. And so the period from 70 to 100 and 70 to 200 is both the period of time in which the Gospels are being developed, evolving, and the period of time in which the Mishnah is being written, right? And so that I think is very interesting and certainly is worth noticing. What is this struggle that's going on? Because the Tzaddukim and the Baitusim were Second Temple. Those were who the rabbis are fighting with in Bayit Sheni. But post Second Temple, we begin to have a group of Jews, right, who are in the rabbinic community, who are thinking and preaching and interpreting differently. And that poses a threat and a danger, okay? It's not only Jesus, and it's not only what becomes Christianity. There are academics who have written about this. What's called minut, or the minim, are different sub-communities of people who really are what we would call rabbinic Jews. They're not biblical Jews. They're not the biblical Jews of the late Second Temple who are arguing about Torah Shebaal Peh. They believe in Torah Shebaal Peh, but they believe in interpreting it differently than the rabbis, and they're not from the academy, right? Like we've seen the Shammai Hillel tension, right? Within the academy, what happens when there are two voices, two different opinions, two different schools of interpretation? That already creates enough tension. But here we're talking about people who are circulating outside of the academy. I'll just give one very interesting argument that the rabbis get very heated about. They get heated about the shape of the tefillin, right? People who want to wear tefillin, but they want round boxes rather than square boxes. Now, they want tefillin, right? They already understand tefillin, and they want to wear tefillin on their hand, not on their arm. The rabbis bring those as proof of heresy, right? But it's a very different heresy than the heresy of the Karaites, right? It's very, very different because they too have oral interpretation of what tefillin should look like, oral interpretation of how you cover the blood of a sacrifice. And so we're not going to spend a semester studying the minim, but I just want you to be aware, right, that it's complicated and it's not as simple as, oh, it's all paganism and it's, and the Christians and other. From within the world of the rabbis, there are schools of interpretation that are being rejected, not even making it into the academy, but they're not the same as the Tzaddokites and the Baitusim. There we saw, first of all, issues in the priesthood, and we saw sometimes literal interpretation of Torah versus rabbinic or oral interpretation. This is different. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I want to get to one source in particular that appears in Shabbat. It's a very interesting source. And pay attention, right? We've seen a number of these rabbis, not all of them. We're going to get to all of them. Okay. Hagilyonim v'sefer minim ein matzilin otam mibnei hadileka ela nisrafin bimkoman hein va'askarotehen. So the rabbis start out, and the language here, the translation is also important. The book of the evangelists and the books of the heretics. So we're calling them Gilyonim, Minim. Right now, when we think of evangelists, we think of Christians, right? Evangelical Christians. But it's meant to be, these are religious people who are practicing differently. And as a result, it's threatening. Now, the evangelists are not the heretics, right? Those are kind of two different descriptions, but they have their own books. And what happens if fire breaks out on Shabbat? There's a whole question, are you allowed to say the Sefer Torah from the fire? The answer is yes. But here you have books. They have God's name in the books, right? This is not idolatry, right? These are not pagans worshiping the sun, right? They have God's name. Hein v'izkarotehen means Yizkorav HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And yet we allow those books to burn on Shabbos. Which suggests maybe we should allow them to burn at any time. But the point is, if a house is burning down and there are Sifrei, Svarim, Sifrei Kedusha, but not our Sifrei Kedusha, and they have God's name, burn down. Rabbi Yassi Haglili Omer, Bechol Koder et Askarotehen, V'gonzan V'soref et Hashar. Rabbi Yassi Haglili says, on weekdays, you find those manuscripts, those scrolls, you cut out the name of God in those scrolls, you bury those names, because what are you going to do? They're pieces of parchment, and then you burn the rest, right? I'm just showing you as a backdrop, before we even get into any specific stories, their attitude towards these teachings, these books, but these books have God's name in them, right? And so we've talked about this when we talked about Second Temple period, right? There's a holy war going on. There's a real war for survival. And we can't all survive. We can't all survive because there has to be clear direction and there has to be a clear passing on of the Masorah. Now, we know a lot about that from our last story, a clear passing on of how we're going to interpret. Rabbi Tarfon then says, and we've heard Rabbi Tarfon say this before, and in the past, Rabbi Akiva has censured him for saying this. Here, Rabbi Akiva stays silent. Ekapach et banai she'im yavod lidei liadi she'afilu harodef rodef. Hold on. Ein makirin v'kofrin. So Rabbi Tarfon says, may I bury my children if such things come into my hands and I do not burn them, and even if the references of the divine name are in them, and if someone were chasing me, I would sooner, pay attention to this line, go into a temple of idolatry than go into their houses of worship, right? That to me says what we're dealing with here, the depth of what we're dealing with. For idolaters do not recognize God when they deny him, but these recognize God and deny him. About them, the Torah states, behind the door and the doorpost, you have set up your simple, right? They have mezuzahs, but they don't believe in God, certainly not in the way they're supposed to believe in God. And so you recognize, right, that there's something really, really off here in how the rabbis are seeing these houses of worship and these practicers of religion, to the point that I'd rather go into a temple of idolatry, right? Because there it's really clear, idolatry, us. But when I go into their houses of worship, I may not realize I'm not in a synagogue. I may be deceived. I may think this is legitimate, and it's not legitimate. Amar Rabbi Yishmael.
Nechama, could you liken that to Reform Judaism today?
So I want to try to be careful not to do that, but I am going to do that in a moment. I'm going to talk about Reform Judaism at the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, I will. Okay. Not. Okay. I don't want to get into it today, and I think Reform Judaism has changed, and I think the thread is no longer the thread. But yes, I do think there's a parallel to what happened when Reform Judaism really, really threatened Orthodox Judaism, which was the beginning of the 20th century, beginning to mid. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Mayim lahatil shalom ben ish leishto. Now, if to bring peace, Rabbi Yishmael, right? So we've seen Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yishmael. These really, again, are the greats of Yavne, of the early Tannaitic period. These are the people we are looking to for leadership. All three of them appear in this passage. And Rabbi Yishmael now says, Mayim lahatil shalom ben ish liishto amar hamakom sefer shenichtav b'kedusha yimacha al hamayim. Now, we know God allows his name to be erased from a scroll in order to bring peace between husband and wife. Sefer minim shemitilin eva ben Yisrael la'aviyam shebashamayim al acha kama v'kama, right? So the books of the heretics, which bring enmity between Israel and their father in heaven, al acha kama v'kama, how much more so? So what we see, and that's why, Sue, I think you asked, right? That there is going to be a parallel. There is going to be a parallel that I can talk about 100 years ago. That there is a real crisis going on here of who's going to follow whom, and the suggestion is we may end up losing the followers, which we desperately need in order to survive, because they're going to go to these houses of worship and these books of sanctity, right? These books of religion, and they're creating eva, hatred, hostility. Eva is such a strong word. Between Yisrael la'avim shashamayim alacha kama v'kama v'kamoshim hu hein v'iskerotean v'alem amar katuv halomi sanecha Adonai yasna kishem she'ein matzilin oto mimnei adleika kach ein matzilin oto lo min hamamcholet v'lo min hamayim v'lo mikol davar hama'abed otam. And so he basically says, the Torah stated, and now he brings everything we've seen before. Do I not hate them that hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe them that rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. Just as they do not save them on account of fire, so too they do not save them from a ruin or a flood or anything that will turn them to rubble. Okay, which, by the way, is the way we treat idolatry. We turn it to rubble. So I'm bringing this as a backdrop so we understand the enormity of the challenge that is facing the rabbis of this period. And it seems to be coming not from idolatry, which was a previous challenge, not from the sects, the sectarianism of the late Second Temple period, but from something really from within, so from within that it's hard at times to really tease out who they are, right? That comes up in a lot of sources I remember from the class I taught many years ago. They may be wearing tefillin and you may not even notice that their tefillin don't look exactly like yours, or that tefillin is being lowered down on the arm because they're wearing tefillin, right? Now, let's remember that there are people who have different sized tefillin, right? At a certain point, we become comfortable. Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin and Rashi's tefillin, right? There are different, where we write the letters, the Sephardi, the Ashkenazi, we become comfortable with difference. But apparently at this time, some of these differences really reflect, I'm going to use the word insidious, something insidious and something threatening the structure of Rabbinic Judaism. And now, Sue, I am going to talk. It was funny because I happened to have mentioned it yesterday in my Pardes class. Because we were talking about Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. And Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, and I heard him say this specifically, I heard him, so I can, Torah Shabbat Peh, where he wondered out loud whether we, meaning the religious community, had not been too alienating or harsh with the Reform movement. And he sat on a panel with a female Reform rabbi, and the Orthodox world, particularly the Haredi world, went absolutely ballistic and threatened to excommunicate him. He never took it back, and it seems to have died down. He's a very, very, very strong person, and his family is a very strong family, and he weathered it. But I don't think, and this is what I know people in America were saying, that he recognizes the Reform movement where it is now. And he doesn't see them as any threat. He doesn't understand. Why are you so threatened by the Reform movement? Like, why shouldn't we sit together and talk to one another, right? Like, why can't we have some sort of chevruta together, l'shem shamayim? Because today, Orthodoxy has survived in an unprecedented manner with literacy and Torah and Shiurim and Daf Yomi and shuls and like it exploded. But pre-World War II, right? Anyone who had grandparents or maybe parents, right, who lived at that time. I remember my grandfather who grew up in Brooklyn talking about the rates of assimilation. And, I think I mentioned this before, my grandmother was one of 10. They all became not religious. She ended up becoming religious because she was infertile and she promised God if she had a baby, she would become religious. So out of 10 children from a religious family that came to Ellis Island, 9 of them assimilated and many of their children intermarried. And that was very, very common. And when the Reform movement comes along, they essentially are offering to people a very different type of Judaism that allows for much more freedom and less restriction, less halachic restriction, eating, right, at certain point, eating treif, not keeping Shabbos, you go to the game, whatever it is, come to the high holiday services with the microphones and so on. And Orthodoxy sees this as an absolute threat to their very existence. Because as it is, they're hemorrhaging. And now comes along Reform rabbi saying, hey, you don't have to be Orthodox, come join us. That's primitive. That's, that's the old school. That's the old world. We're Americans, we're modern. And it really is an incredible threat, which I think Rav Melamed, as being Israeli, just can't possibly fathom the anger, the hostility, the Orthodox world, the grudge that was held for years. And they mocked Orthodoxy, and they mocked particularly ultra-Orthodoxy. And so it was really very ugly and very hostile. And what's a shame to me is today it remains for many Orthodox that hostile and that ugly, even though I think there's much more, there's much more room. I have Reform rabbinical students. They're very interested in ritual. There's a movement of halachic Reform Jews, right? They have softened tremendously in, you no longer have the Reform rabbi not wearing the kippah, eating treif on Yom Kippur. Like, they're interested in building a sukkah, and they're interested in the positive rituals, many of them. I can't talk about all of them. The Reform movement allows rabbis to do, more or less what they want, but after they study. But I will say that like there's been definitely a return to a lot of the positives, even as they allow intermarriage. Right? We know the problem. I'm not going into that. Reform Judaism is not a halachic movement, but it's not a threat. It's not a threat. Kids who leave Orthodoxy, but they don't become Reform Jews, right? It's not like they're stealing our kids away from us. Kids who leave go off the derech completely. They're not interested in the Reform movement or even really the conservative movement. They're interested in leaving it all. And so I think that I do see elements of what you're talking, right? Like when I read these texts, it seems to me it's a fight for a different fight for survival than destruction and exile. a different fight than with those who want to literally interpret Bible without Torah Shebaal Peh, and a different fight than what's going to emerge with the Christians, which in the Talmud is not going to be really referenced that much. Christianity is not really a direct threat to rabbinic Judaism, not for a long time. I mean, it's going to be a threat because they're going to want to kill us, right, at a certain point. But it's not going to be a threat to our religious identity. This, whatever is being described here, which is a little amorphous, the heretics, the evangelists, that's a real threat. And they do know that eventually Christianity, they're going to be very negative about Jesus because they know that a religion's going to be born that's going to torment us, that's going to cause us tremendous distress and loss and so on. They know that, but they're not going to make a big deal about it, meaning Christianity is not going to be directly referenced too often in the Talmud. And I'll say one more interesting thing. Many of the sources about Jesus, I think all of them, not just many, there aren't that many, but are removed by the censor in the Middle Ages from the print editions, and only if you go back to the manuscripts can you find them. So the Christian censor is removing our references to Jesus because they're largely very negative. And that too is very interesting. If you open up Schottenstein, you won't find the Jesus stories I'm going to bring. They're just not there. They were removed from the print edition and they were not put back in. And it's possible that in the footnote, the editor will refer to something was removed here because of the censor. Steinsaltz puts it back in. Steinsaltz, not surprisingly, puts it back in, but Schottenstein did not, because Schottenstein uses the Vilna very, very deliberately. Okay, comments, questions? I think what we'll do is look at maybe just the first source. I have 6 minutes left, and I like to use your time.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to disturb you. The Koran, is that also, wasn't there a Koran?
The Koran is Steinsaltz.
Oh, that is Steinsaltz. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hold on. So what I want to bring, so I'm going to bring actually just the birth of our birth version of Jesus. It's interesting, and again, some of you may know it, some of you may not. I'm using a source sheet that I put in the link today in the email that I hope they sent out. But we're going to look at our version. And what's interesting about our version, is it shares elements with some of Christianity's version, what's his name? Hold on, there's a name of the famous, not Eusebius, Clericus. I think Clericus's version. Okay, we're in Masechet Shabbat. Hamisaret al Bisaro. Tanya Amar lehem Rabbi Eliezer l'chachamim v'halo ben Stada. Hotzi ksafim mimitzrayim b'srita she'al b'saro. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus, who himself is a bit of a magician. And we're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer, the magician, and Jesus, who also has magical powers. Didn't the infamous Ben Stada, that's Jesus, take magic spells out of Egypt in a scratch on his flesh? Didn't he write incantations on his flesh in order to get them out of Egypt? No, sotahaya. Ve'ein mevi'in raya min hasotim. Shotim. He was a shota. He was a fool. We don't bring proof from fools. They're talking, the argument, of course, in the Mishnah is writing on skin writing. And Rabbi Eliezer says, well, Ben Stada wrote on his skin and it remained right. And then he took information out of Egypt. That's pretty significant. That's writing. So what do they say now? Amar Rav Chisda, this is his birth story. Ben Stada ben Pandera here. It's not really Ben Stada. His name is Ben Pandera. Amar Rav Chisda, Bal Stada Boel Pandera, Bal Papus ben Yehudahu, Ella imo Stada imo Miriam Megadla, Magdalene, Sa'ar Nasi Nashi Have, Ella Keda'amre Bapupantita, Stata da Mibala. Okay, let's see the story in English. Why did they call him Ben Stada? His name is really Ben Pandera. Rav Chisda said his mother's husband, who acted as his father, was named Stada, but she really had relations with Pandera. Now, what we're going to see in the rabbinic sources is the trope of promiscuity is going to be very much in the background of Jesus's birth. We're going to see prostitutes appear in other ways in the sources. So she was married to someone named Stada, and as we know in Judaism, Rov Habilot Achar Habal, if a woman is married and she has an affair, we don't immediately, and the husband lives with her, we say, well, most sexual intercourse is with the husband. That's a rabbinic principle, it's a Talmudic principle, a halachic principle. And so even if we kind of know she had an affair, we assume the child is the husband's and we don't ask further questions. And so we're saying about her, Ben Stada, he's called after Stada, but really he's the son of Pandera. And one of the words, I think Pandera means Roman soldier in Latin. And the idea was like a soldier passing through town, got her pregnant, right? Because she was illicit. Wasn't his mother's Papos Ben Yehuda? Wait a minute. Don't we think her mother's name is, the father was the husband was Papos? His mother was named Stada, and he was named Ben Stada after her. Wait, wasn't his mother Miriam, who braided women's hair long, Megadla, but we have a hint there of Magdalene. Now, of course, Mary of Magdalene was not the Mary, there were two Marys, but you have something there in the Megadla that scholars say might hint to Magdalene, right? Well, didn't she braid women's hair?
I'm sorry. Oh,
What?
wasn't this? I missed something. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
Was this Jesus's mother you're talking about?
Yes, this is about
But
Jesus'
wasn't-
birth. I mean, I'll pick up next week and we'll do a little more. I'm just
Because she's a virgin, isn't she supposed
well,
to?
but our version is she's very much not. Right. In other words, it's
Okay,
very important
okay.
to us in his birth story to have her not be a virgin. She's not a virgin.
Okay, thank you very much.
Rather, Stada was merely a nickname, as they say in Pumpadita. This one strayed from her husband. Okay, well, because it's already 10:09, I'm going to pick up with this next week. The rabbinic version of Jesus's birth, and everyone knows this is Jesus, because in other places he's going to be called Ben Pantera, Ben Stada, Ben Pantera, who is Ben Stada, who is, again, you see Stada might be a reference to his mother who strayed, her hair of the Sota, right? Like there are all sorts of very clever allusions being placed into this source, but all of them lead to one conclusion, that his mother was not a virgin, right? She had a husband, she might have had a lover, he might be a mamzer, right? Like all of those are very deliberate to make it very clear that he was not some sort of magical, birth, some sort of virgin birth. And yes, that is very deliberate, right? In a Jewish source, it's going to be very important to establish his birth narrative as having been very ordinary and possibly promiscuous, right? That's going to be our way of responding to the Christian claim, okay? So we're going to come back to that. I will say one interesting thing. We do know Jesus went down to Egypt with his family at some point, right? Like that piece is actually borne out by Christian and then came back. The sorcery piece, obviously, we'll come into, and then came back, right? So we did go down to Egypt and he came back, his family. So that piece at least is the jumping off point to get to his birth story, that he went down to Egypt and came back with magic. But his mother's name is Miriam, right? The Megadla, Peter Schaefer suggests might be a reference to Mary of Magdalene, right? Like there's stuff going on here. It's a little distorted. It's a little frenetic. What name is what, whose name is who, but it is definitely deliberate, right? This is also, they don't mention Yeshu and they don't mention Notzrat, right? That'll come up in other stories. The censor does not take this out, right? Like if you're reading this, you really don't know this is about Jesus unless you're with it, unless you know this is what we're talking about, okay? So we're gonna stop there. Everyone should have a quiet Shabbat, a beautiful, peaceful Shabbat, a blessed Shabbat. All your family and loved ones should be well and safe. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And as I said, next week I should be in person for those who want to join me.
Can I just
Excellent.
say,
Yeah, of course.
First of all, Mary Magdalene was Mary of Magdala, which was the old name for Migdal. That was
Yafeh.
and the idea of Maria being a virgin was to do with Greek beliefs, that the
Okay.
gods came from virgin mothers or something
Very
like
nice.
that.
Very nice.
So they were sort of playing with some of the Greek culture of the time to sort of raise her to a higher level.
A higher godlike level, level. Very interesting. That makes sense. Thank you.
The lectures I had on this were a long time ago, but I seem to remember that there was some
Yeah.
Greek culture involved in her being a virgin, or supposed to be. Yeah.
Right. And that's
Which
obviously only
also-
going to come out later in the Gospels, right?
Yeah.
The birth story.
Which also
Um,
contradicts the whole idea of Jesus being descended from King David, because his father Joseph, according to
Was
their
the descendant. Right, right.
descended, but
Right.
if he wasn't the biological son of Joseph, so they sort of skip over that.
Yeah, that doesn't, right. Yeah,
But no,
yes, thank you. That was, I think, a very insightful comment. Thank you. Okay.
Nechama, that piece that we just read now, so that wasn't censored? Is that
No,
still in the
because that's
Shotton-
in the Mishnah. That's a Mishnah, I believe. Hold on, let me just check. I believe that's the Mishnah in Shabbat or the Tosefta, and it's Shabbat. Yeah, that actually did not get. I don't believe that got censored. You know what? I'm gonna check. I don't think that got censored. I don't think so. But I'm gonna. You know what? If you wait 1 minute, I have a way to check. Hold on. Let me just see, because I have a Steinsaltz right here, and he'll say very quickly if it was censored. Maybe I'm wrong, and that's okay. Again, I haven't taught this in a while. Up Daled. Here we go.
So, but it's not in the Schottenstein edition.
No, I'm checking. If it was censored, it won't be in the Schottenstein. If it was not
Okay.
censored, it will be in the Schottenstein. Here, Kotev. Here, it's going to be here, Bissaro. So let me just see. Manuscripts. Let's see. Haketa al social ben stada v'kein Rashi and so on. No, it was all removed. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking. I'll start with that next week. This was removed. This is considered very I thought maybe because they used ben stada ben pantera, but apparently the Christian censor knew exactly who we were talking about. Yeah, this was removed. This you will
But
not.
where did you get
you'll
your-
find this in
I'm
the
sorry.
Schottenstein.
But
What?
where did you get what you're quoting now? What you're quoting now? Where did you get that from? If it's not in the
Steinsaltz,
Koran.
and this will be in the Koran, Steinsaltz will always mention in the margins if there has been manuscript emendations. He does it throughout. Meaning that's one of the things he adds, and he writes here in a little paragraph this whole passage of the birth of Ben Stada was removed in most of the print editions by the censor. Yeah, but it's
Thank
in the manuscripts, which is why we were able to get it back.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. I'll clarify that next week. Okay, thanks. Oh, this was lovely. To have
Thank
a
you.
look.
Great share. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.